it's really easy to mislead yourself when you're looking back at your life about what the decisions were that you made in relation to your own career and education, about short-term decisions that had long-term consequences, about what information you had at the time and what information you did not. I have known a lot of people who consciously and intentionally cultivated a sort of mythology around themselves, who invented lies about the decisions they made, why they took on the career and education directions they did. But even if you're not in that school of thought, even if you're not intentionally lying to yourself and others, it's really easy to remember your own life as if you had access to information at the time that you did not, in fact, have. I made a lot of decisions in the last 2 years that I regret, but in talking about them, I have to be really clear about what I knew, what I assumed, what I thought I knew, and what my hopes and aspirations were. Sure, but how differently I now perceive the situation from how I perceived it at the time. Very easy to go back and rewrite your own personal history with no bad intentions because you forget what you didn't know. You have to tell the story placing sufficient emphasis on what you did not know. So in terms of career and education, right off the top here, I'm now living in Dehong, China. Dehong is in Yunnan province on the border with Myanmar. When I first moved here, when I first made the decision to move here, my employer asked me to stay for 3 years minimum and said they would be happy to have me for 5 years as a professor here. So that's pretty long-term employment. And one of the questions they asked in the job interview is, how many years can you stay? And I said, 5 years, no problem. And they said, okay, great. They would probably do a contract off the bat for 3 years. They'd commit to employing me for 3 years. So already it's very easy to forget that in retrospect, right? So I've been here for, like 10 months, like a 10-month period. And again, one academic year is almost never 12 months. An academic year can be 8 months. But this is less than a 1-year gig for me, it turns out. And then I'm going back to Canada. So there's a lot already packed into that. Why would I have made the decision to move from Canada to Kunming? Why did I make the decision to move from Kunming to Dehong? And why do I regret it now? One of the things that really shaped this decision was the pressure on me, which I felt profoundly, to have a home where I could host my own daughter visiting me. So my daughter is now 4 years old. She was 3 years old when I was worried about this. I felt that I was in a situation where at any time my lawyer could tell me, hey, we made progress on your case. Now you've got visitation rights for your daughter. Visitation rights means temporary custody. For a few weeks here or there, your daughter's coming over. So now, guess what? All of a sudden, your daughter's coming over to stay at your house. So I did not want to be in a 1-bedroom basement apartment in Canada when that happened. When I lived in Canada, it wasn't a basement apartment. I forget, I was on the 4th floor. But anyway, I was in an apartment building. I wanted to be in a real home with real facilities and real space, just, a beautiful home where I could really host my daughter. So this job offered me that. It is a beautiful, huge apartment. It's big enough for a family of 4, 5, or 6. It's big enough for a family of 4 at least. And I know other professors who live in this building, who live in identical apartments and have a family of 4 or more. So that's no joke. It's a beautiful apartment. It's in a beautiful place. It's in a location where I'd be proud to have my daughter here. There's a fabulous swimming pool down the road. I remember when I first moved in here, or first visited here actually, I took photographs of this swimming pool and sent them to my ex-wife. There are palm trees. There's a beautiful mountain you can walk up the side of. There are a lot of activities here for a 3- and 4-year-old. That'd be fabulous. And also fundamentally, I just have the floor space. I have a great kitchen. I have great floor space where I can have a 3-year-old or 4-year-old sitting and playing with Lego on the floor. This is a home where I'd be happy to host my daughter. So right away, in terms of the offer to come here for like 5 years, this is a huge incentive for me. And now, with the information I have now, I totally regret that decision because I now know it was basically impossible for me to be in the situation I was fearing and preparing for, practically, right? Because the reality is what the French court system did to me, and I think a good lawyer could have advised me this would happen, or anyone with a lot of experience in French divorce court could have advised me. The reality of the situation I was in was that my daughter wouldn't come here to join me. Instead, I would go there. I would have to rent an apartment in France, go and hang out there. Now, another thing that really motivated me, which again is now hard to remember in retrospect, is that prior to learning Chinese, I had years of experience working on the related Southeast Asian languages of Pali, Lao, Thai, Cambodian, even Burmese. I'd worked on these Southeast Asian languages that are very closely related to the local language here, which is called Daiyu, Dehong Dai, the Dehong Dai language. So the idea of moving here and living here for several years was not just to learn Chinese as a language, but would have opened the door to my being engaged with a language that incredibly few Westerners have studied and that I was incredibly well prepared for, having worked on Lao, having worked on Northern Lao, aka Thai Nua, and having worked on Pali as a written language, as a dead language. Moving to Dehong presented me with the opportunity not only to sort of complete my Chinese language education, but to also to move forward and move backward in my career at the same time, to move forward to a new area of language study, because I'd never worked on Dehong Dai specifically, but in a sense it was also moving backward. It was capitalizing on, it was making something useful out of more than 10 years of research in my life. More than 10 years of research that I did while living in Canada, also while living in Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and while living in Dehong, Yunnan, while living in Kunming, Yunnan, back in 2007, 2008. Here was an opportunity for me not just to progress further with my knowledge of the Chinese language, but in a sense to regress, to go back to a group of languages that I really worked very hard on in the past and that I could now develop specialized expertise in. And I knew just one white man who had a PhD in that area, one white man who has a PhD in Dehong Dai, and I think he's the only English-speaking man to have a PhD in that language in Dehong Dai. Sorry, I say white man to be brief. Obviously, I'm totally happy to work with a black person or anyone who speaks English who studied that language, but I'm using that as a shorthand to mean he's someone who's a scholar in that field who doesn't speak Chinese as his first language or doesn't speak Southeast Asian language as his first language. He's a white Australian who comes out of that academic background. So there seem to be unique opportunities, long-term opportunities, linked to moving here. And I now know that absolutely all of them are hollow, all of them are unreal. Based on the information I have today, I completely regret my decision to move here. In reality, after 6 or 7 months in Kunming learning Chinese, I had already accomplished the purpose of this trip, and the smart thing for me to have done would have been to move back to Canada as soon as possible, get back into a master's degree in Canada as soon as possible, finish my second BA at University of Victoria. I have one BA from University of Toronto. Finish my second BA at University of Victoria, go on to get an MA at University of Victoria, and then go on to get a PhD ASAP. What really made sense with all the information I had now would have been to go back to Canada and get on the PhD track absolutely as soon as possible. But there was another motivation, a kind of short-term motivation that has long-term implications. My father was dying. My father was dying a long, slow death, and he's now deceased. And I did feel the pressure to get a job here in China simply because that was what I promised to do in the first place when I came over. Now, there's a really funny story there that I'm not going to tell. It's a really funny story that's hard to summarize and make brief. But when I first moved to Kunming, it wasn't just to become a student. I was supposed to be a student temporarily for just a couple of months, and then I was supposed to start this job as a university professor, university instructor, teaching English in a small university in Kunming. So Kunming is a much bigger city. That's Kunming and Dehong are two different places. The bus trip between Kunming and Dehong is about 12 hours. They're far apart, and there are a lot of mountains in between, all right? Just for that reason, I did feel as though as soon as I came to Kunming, as soon as I came here to China, I had to kind of pound the pavement and find a job here. Because my father, who paid for my airplane ticket over here, my father, who paid for me to be in Chinese language lessons in Kunming, and who to some extent I think really did understand the whole situation, he assumed that I was not just coming here to study, but I was also coming here to work. And, again, it's really easy to get these things mixed up in your own mind and your own heart at the time and in retrospect. The truth is, the only reason why that job was worth taking was the short-term opportunity to learn and practice speaking Chinese. So after 6 months in China, there was no point in accepting a job of that kind anyway. There was no point in pursuing or applying for a job of that kind anyway. My reasons for doing that were already defunct. They were already obsolete. I should have gone back to Canada right away, got back into a master's program, and then back into a PhD track as soon as possible. That would have been the smart thing to do. But again, there was this looming pressure on me to have a home, a real home, and a real job for my daughter, to be a host to my daughter. There was this looming pressure on me, which again is partly just to my own imagination, but partly was something explicitly discussed between me and my father, who was on his deathbed, to have a job here in China, to be employed here, not to just study here and then go back into university education in Canada. There was this prospect of studying these more obscure languages, Dehong Dai, and also to make use of the education I already had in Pali, which, Mangshi seemed to present to me. And, there are a few more factors that are slipping my mind now, and I really wanted to get this down in video. I really wanted to get these reflections down in video because I know this is something my own mother doesn't understand. My own mother doesn't understand what kind of went into these decisions, and I'm even afraid that I'm going to lose sight of this. I'm afraid that I'm going to forget why it was I made these series of decisions for such peculiar short-term reasons that are now going to have such a long-term impact on my life. There are some people, I'm live streaming right now, and now in going back to Canada, I'm looking at enrolling in a course in cuisine to train to become a baker. I'm looking at getting an education in baking bread, baking pastries, so that I have a basis both for the future of the vegan movement and for my own financial future, so that I could one day open my own bakery, or indeed obviously work in other people's bakeries, maybe run a catering service on the side. It's really easy to imagine baking and catering, whether it's bread or pastries or what have you, being a vegan baker. It's really easy for me to imagine that being something positive I could do while engaged in getting an MA and PhD, while engaged in long years of research and education before I get my next real paying gig. I can imagine it being a very positive thing. However, it's misleading to look at that as like a well put together plan or decision I made rationally and thinking long term. The reality is I was forced into a short-term crisis just because of the court-ordered dates on which I have to go and visit my daughter. My ex-wife could negotiate with me to change the dates. I would have only wanted to change them by about 2 weeks or something, one way or the other. But my ex-wife refused to do so. And I had a really brief window of opportunity between when this job ended in China, when then I would have had to leave this job in China, fly back to Canada where I have no apartment, I have no home, find a new apartment, rent a new apartment, furnish a new apartment, start a new life with nothing kind of thing. Enroll in classes at UVic, get back into the school, start that again, and then fly to France, and then fly back from France to Canada. The timeline was almost impossible because of the court-ordered dates for when I had to fly to France and see my daughter for the second time. I've already visited her once. I had no choice about that. My ex-wife refused to let me, just move the dates by a couple weeks to make it possible, and I had no way of knowing that in advance. I had no way of planning around that in terms of this job or going back to University of Victoria. So I suddenly had this hole created in my schedule where I can't go back to Victoria and resume my education now. So again, if I had known this, if I had known any of this, I never would have moved to Dehong. I never would have taken up this job in China. I would have wrapped up studying Chinese in Kunming as soon as possible. I would have gone back to UVic and again, gone on the MA and PhD track absolutely as soon as possible. And it's only because of this short-term crisis, which is created ultimately by my need to go and visit my daughter and my need to go and visit my daughter on a court-ordered schedule, etc. It's only because of that I'm now looking at going back to Ontario, different part of Canada, enrolling in baking college, getting a credential, and possibly getting a whole new career as a vegan baker before I go back to University of Victoria, finish that BA, get an MA, get on the PhD track, during which time I hope I'm going to have credentials as a vegan baker. Sorry, there's a lot more packed into this. My point is, I'm making this video really trying to be honest with myself. I'm really trying to be honest with my own mom. I'm definitely going to send her a copy of this video. And, whatever, if my daughter sees this 10 years from now, being honest with my own daughter too. A lot of people make these kinds of decisions short term. And whether you regret them or embrace them, I mean, I've got to say, if somebody asked me why did I end up as a major in political science back in 1997, 1998, when I was at University of Toronto, when I was going through university the first time, the truth is there's no good answer. There's a really complex story about totally surreal short-term conditions and a short-term crisis, and my making that decision with none of the information I needed to make a good decision and no source of guidance that would have helped me. The decisions I made, sincerely trying to do my best in relation to this divorce, in relation to the languages I was studying, in relation to my academic career and so on, short-term decisions where I had none of the information I needed. And it's really easy, with no intent to deceive and no intention, self-deception, no intention to make a myth out of my own life. It's really easy for me to look back on these last 2 years and just get garbled up in my own mind's eye what information I had and what information I did not have when I made these decisions to move to Kunming, to move to Dehong, concerning when I was going to return to Canada and what I was going to do when I get there. But long story short, I'm not mousy about this word regret. And I've got to tell you, I regret it all. All of the decisions, given the information I have now, even given some of the really simple information I wish my divorce lawyer had given me, I regret going to University of Victoria in the first place. I regret majoring in Chinese. I regret switching the major to Japanese after that. I regret moving to Kunming. I regret moving to Mangshi. One of the main reasons I came out here to Kunming and then later to Dehong, I came out here to Yunnan, China, was also the awareness that this would be a great place for my ex-wife. Because this is where I used to live with my ex-wife. I lived with my ex-wife I met her in Dehong, Yunnan, and then we moved to Kunming together back in 2007, 2008. We used to live together in Kunming. This is a great place for her and her anthropological research, what she did her PhD in. This is a great place for her to visit me, if she was bringing my daughter over to spend time with me here, something I now know will never happen. This seemed like the right decision. This seemed like a great option and a great opportunity for me and for my family, in a sense, a family that includes my ex-wife. It seemed like the right decision for so many reasons, but keeping it all the way real, knowing what I now know, it was wrong.